name is Carl Eugene Lundeen. My parents were Fred H. Lundeen and Sarah H. Lundeen. He was born just after his parents arrived in America, and my mother was born in Sweden, came here when she was 16. And like I said, I was born in Navarre, Kansas, just outside of Abilene, in when was I born? 32? Graduated from high school in Chapman, Kansas in May of 1950. I worked for my father, a construction company, building Dairy Queen, remodeling houses and so forth until 52, when I got a nice letter from Uncle Sam, said, please come join us for vacation. But prior to that, I'd enlisted in the Air Force, and I was waiting to get my papers back from them. I got my rejection from the Air Force on Monday, because this little finger doesn't bend, and my draft notice on Tuesday, because that's when Korea was running hot and heavy. Drafted in 52, and went to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas for 3 months. I was supposed to go to officers training school in Fort Sill. Instead, I got on the battalion basketball team and broke my foot. Spent 6 weeks in the hospital playing ping pong with my cast on. Then a couple thousand of us would fall out each Friday with orders for Korea, and that happened 2 weeks in a row. They called everybody's name except 3 of us. So the third time they said, come to the office. Said, on this blackboard are some red and blue pens, pick one. So I did. It turned out to be Augsburg, Germany. So instead of Korea, I ended up in Germany.
And how long were you there for?
Well, a little less than 2 years.
And what did you do in the military?
I was in the artillery. I was the weapons supply sergeant. I went over as a private, got increased to corporal immediately, and I wore sergeant stripes, which I still have in the drawer right here. So I had all the privileges of a enlisted man, and also did an officer's job as battery security officer. So if I went in my civvies, I could go to the officers club. If I wore my uniform, I had to go to the NCO club. I had a real different kind of deal.
Yeah, it is.
But no, I don't regret my military at all. I traveled all over Germany, France, wrote my own passes on weekends, had a great time. If you volunteered, it was 4 years. If I got accepted into the Air Force, it would have been for 4 years. But when you're drafted, it's only 2 years. So when I finished my time in Germany, they offered me a direct promotion to West Point. And I'd already had almost 2 years of service by then. I wanted to go to college. It'd been nice to go to West Point, but I realized I was older than the rest of them, and decided to come home and go to college instead.
So my mom's heritage came from she was born in Kansas, but her family came from East Germany. At the time it was called Prussia, and on the older maps you see that. And her great-great-grandfather played in the Berlin Orchestra, but it wasn't really called Berlin at that time, but that's what it was known to. And her family came over. We went to Salt Lake City and we researched her family, and they came through Ellis Island. We have the name of the boat that they came on and the date. And so they went from there straight over to Kansas, because there was a large German settlement in Kansas. And her family only spoke German. In fact, her grandmother only spoke German. My mom knew German at the time because she talked with her grandma. But then there was a point during World War II where they didn't want anyone speaking German. And so in the town in Kansas, everyone that spoke German just had to not use it. And all the kids just learned English. So she grew up singing opera. They would put her on the street corner to sing, and upstairs there's a picture of my mom dressed like Shirley Temple. And she loved Shirley Temple, and so she would go sing, and they would pay her to go sing on the street corners. And so she just grew up entertaining people, talking to people and singing and entertaining. And then she went to, for a while, she went to Dallas, and she worked for Neiman Marcus. She had a very good fashion sense. She was an artist. And so at one point in Dallas, she would work all day and at it was an accounting firm. And then she would go work for Neiman Marcus for a little while, and then she would go sing. And then the police would pick her up to take her to her morning job, which was working in a butcher shop. And then she'd go back and she'd do the same thing over and over and over every day.
I lived in Kansas till I was 21, and then I came to Albuquerque. I went to college and then I came to Albuquerque. Went to Kansas State University, graduated in business and accounting in 1959. We arrived in Albuquerque February 1st in 1959 in the biggest dust storm you ever saw in your life.
After Dallas, she went back to Kansas, and then she enrolled in Brown Mackie College for accounting, and that's where she met my dad. He was her teacher. That's how love stories go, and they got married, and then they moved here to New Mexico.
Made our visiting trip down here. I went to work for a company in Kansas City, and they said drive down to New Mexico and see if you want to transfer there. We drove in on an August afternoon, just rained, it was beautiful, so we came. We got here in February, it was dry, the red dust blew in from Arizona, covered everything. I called back to Kansas City and said, get me the hell out of here. He said, you signed up for 2 years, call me in 2 years. So instead, in 2 years, I quit and stayed. Because by then I liked it, found that was a once in a decade deal. We lived on Guadalupe Trail North, which is a beautiful area. And then the company wanted us all to buy a new house in the Heights, so we did. Candelaria and Wandabo, I bought a tri-level, nice house, hated every minute of it. Started looking back in the valley. Took me 10 years to get back here. I couldn't find a property where I could have horses. They kind of frown on horses on Wandabo and Candelaria. So anyway, I come back down here. We bought this in '68. And we come down here in '68, and my wife didn't have too good eyes. She wasn't really able to see the mess this place was in, but I knew. And that's when I was telling you before, we had a 5-year plan to get it cleaned up, which we're still working on.
What was your wife's name?
Donna A. McCoy from Hugoton, Kansas. Her family immigrated from her dad from Ireland and her mother from Germany. Back in my day, everybody came from somewhere. But anyway, I met her when I was going to school in Salina, Kansas after I got out of service. She was my student. It took a lot of homework. So we got married and went to college in Kansas State. Her commitment to get married was only if I got a college degree and became a CPA. I said, okay. So I did.
So you have this city lady in Kansas coming out here to New Mexico to what they consider to be the Wild West, and then living on a farm. And that's where it just became just plain funny. I don't think it was funny to her at the time, but in the book it talks about it. It's food played such a big part of the farm because my parents came out of that. Like Dad grew up, raised everything they ate. On the way home from school, he'd shoot a rabbit, and that was dinner. You know, they took their guns to school. I mean, talk about it. So the guns are not the issue. Guns are not bad. They took their guns to school. They just were trained and disciplined on how to handle their gun. And so on the way home from school, Dad would shoot a rabbit or a pheasant. He would take it home. He'd dress it out. His mom would cut it out, and that was dinner. So for him, they had food, but they worked very hard to get food. Whereas for my mom, they didn't have a farm, and they moved quite a bit. So if they didn't have the money for food, they went without. It was just different. And so for my mom, food was always a big issue. And so when we were raised, And Dad, and we didn't always have this big house and all this stuff. And so when he started his CPA firm and we moved out here, money was super, super, super tight. And I remember if we didn't grow it, pretty much we didn't have it. So us kids grew up, we knew we'd spend the whole summer canning. We knew we'd be canning tomatoes and pickles and beets, and we just knew it. And mincemeat or whatever it is we did. And we knew that when Dad was going to kill out a chicken, well, that meant that it was coming in here, and we had to have boiling water, and we had to have pliers, and we had to pick out all the pin feathers. I mean, we knew that.
Became a CPA in 1960, and I closed my practice in 1999. So essentially I had my own practice for 40, 50 years.
And when we first moved out here, it was taking a lot of money to get my dad's business going on his own. So we did everything to save money. So we canned pickles, and we raised pigs and cows and chickens, and it was a real farm as a kid. So we first had our chores, and I foolishly wanted a horse, which I got, and that means you have to ride your horse every day, and you have to get out there whether it's rain or snow and feed them, and you gotta go collect chicken eggs and be chased by evil little lambs and things like that.
Had my own company on Carlisle, Lunding, and Jenny. Very good practice, made a very good living. No complaints. Retired in 1999. Got rid of all my horses 2 years ago. We had racehorses here for 50 years.
Why'd you get rid of them?
I'm getting old. Just as simple as that. And they're hard to handle. You get hurt a lot. Between horses and motorcycles, I've had both ankles broken, right leg broken, left knee, the left arm. You get hurt. Everything I tell you is relayed to us by people that were here. And there's very little documentary proof. It's all verbal. But accordingly, the Charles Ellis came from England somewhere in the 1870s. Came to New York by boat, ended up in Albuquerque, and ended up down the South Valley, and either homesteaded this property or bought it from the homesteader. It's not clear which. And he was here from the 70s until he died in 1932. Now his son, Charles E. Ellis, he was the one that lived here following him. He built this house. He built a dairy that was here. He ran the dairy. And he died also. His wife and kids continued to run the property from 32 until 1940 when the dairy barn burned down. And then they said, that's enough, and they left. They sold it to a guy named Winfield, who then sold it to us in 1968. So, but there was a lady living on the property when we came in '68 that came here in somewhere in the 1800s. Her family was in the Oklahoma land rush. I don't remember what year that was. They didn't get any land, so they come on down to New Mexico. I did her tax return for years. On the tax return, you have to put your age. She wouldn't tell me. I thought she probably looked like 110, but I put her down as 90. I was generous. She told me that when she came here, she worked when they were building the dairy, and that was way back prior to 1900. She worked for them, and she lived back here in a little house back here in this part back here with the Bracheros. There were about 10 of them lived back here, and eventually they let her buy a small mobile home that was on the property up here, and she was still in that mobile home when we came. Then she died a few years later. And then there was a realtor that lived in this building over here. His family came here and they worked in the dairy, and he was raised here. And he'd come out and tell us about all the things that happened here in the early 1900s. And he died in about 20 years ago, so I guess, I don't know what age he was. But anyway, he was here when the dairy was here and everything was happening. The garlic fields are across the lane here. And then we had some other people that, like Baldwin, who had the Baldwin Texaco over here. His family came here in the late 1800s, and they lived here for years. There's an awful lot of people in the South Valley that came and homesteaded. But if you try to find their records, you can't find them. And this property here, we know the people that were here, what they told us is probably the only version you're going to get. Now, she was here when they had the Pony Express, which, as I said, Charles E. Ellis thought this was going to make him rich. He got paid $1 a month for housing the horses back here. It only lasted 3 months. They made 5 trips from Neosho, Missouri, to here. And then this thing came called a train. And his Pony Express was over. And then he also he housed the mules for the mule trains that came down from the mountains in Golden and so forth. They came down here and then went on to Phoenix, and he had the mules for the exchange trip. So he had quite an operation back here.
Do you know what year that was?
No, God, I don't know. Back in early 1900s, 1890s, 1900s. And I know what he said was true as far as back here, because when I was farming that property, I would plow up pieces of the building and the adobe and so forth. And I still have some of the iron and the single trees and so forth that come out of that property. But like I say, everything that we have is told to us by the old people and pretty hard to document.
Yeah.
But you can't get a better source than yet from the people that were here. And like I said, there were a lot of people involved here. When the lady that was here in the trailer, when she came here, the Tebow Indians still lived on the back of the property. And Mr. Ellis had to buy them out. He had to pay them money to leave. The Tebows are the basic ones for the Hamas and for the Sleda and so forth. And they all lived back here and they worked for him. But he had to go through a title deal and actually buy their property, even though they had no deed. And Charles R. Ellis, the one that owned it in the 1900s, he had no deed. His father, Charles E. Ellis, acquired the property. He never had a deed. When we came here, the Winfields that sold it to us had what do they call it, when you have a title documentary. Anyway, they had that, and they left it for us, and we lost it, which is a shame. But it covered everything that happened from 1900 on up to current. And what happens, we refinanced the property in 1975. We loaned it to the title company to copy out of, and they say they threw it away, but I'm sure they kept it. So we lost all of that. We read it, and we know what it said in there, but we don't have it. But it's quite a history of the property. There's a lot of people that were here, a lot of people involved in the neighborhood. I mean, this was quite an operation. They had the dairy, they had the Pony Express, they had the mules, they had the garlic fields, they had the orchards, they had the wine, they had the apple cider. It was a big operation. Hate to say it, but I'm probably one of your last sources.
Yeah,
Most of the stuff that the Ellises told us, I mean, we have, like in the basement, we still have the original equipment for the winemaking. And they said his father bought the crusher in the 1880s, and he had the press made. Down in the basement, there's a press that you turn. He had that made about 1900. And it's been in use here ever since, and I still use it. When I do these grapes, which I'm going to be doing in just a few days, I'll use the crusher that he had, 1880s, something, whatever. Still works. And to press the grapes, I'll use the same press that he had. You can tell by the iron in the press that it's old original cast iron There wasn't much of that done after the early 1900s. So that's pretty good evidence that's probably all true. And of course the old apple barrels are down there that I showed you. Originally there were 7 of those. And they made enough apple cider every year that they supplied the whole neighborhood. And their wine that they sold locally, and some of it went to the Santa Fe Railroad. And they did that for years. But when Mr. Ellis died in '32, then that all stopped. Because the Winfields bought the property and they did nothing. That everything just said. 1947.
So the Winfields bought it in 1947?
Yeah, that's when Mrs. Ellis and her kids left and moved to Orange, Texas. And most of this we have pretty well verbally from the son of Ellis, who lived in Orange, Texas, who was born here. And he lived out in the old shack that was out here that we didn't tear it down, it finally just fell down. And that was the house they built in the 1870s or 80s, and it fell down in 1973. And the old wood from that house is what I'm still using now to make picture frames and so forth. That's going in our houses. Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of it out there in the shed, and I make those and I sell them. And the ones I made for Darlene this week, you can see upstairs I made picture frames, I got a mirror frame and so forth. That's all from the original wood from that old house. This has been Whining with Carl for this station, and I'll see you next time.